reporting here on Weisselberg's past depositions. There was the criminal probe of Trump U. Weisselberg described his relationship with Trump as close but one-sided then. He said, I wouldn't go in there and just chit-chat, but if I had a reason to go in and discuss a business matter, we'd have a conversation. This is context for a very special guest we have to join our panel tonight, Tristan Snell, prosecutor who helped lead the investigation of Trump U. Thank you for joining us. Trump U famously was a business that gave out business advice that ultimately went out of business. So it wasn't a great smash success. But to Michael Steele's point, which you can pick up on, there is the view that even when caught, even to the tune of millions, the big guy tends to swim off. What are your insights on all of this from your experience there?
Well, we actually got a court decision in that case that he didn't swim off. We actually got a court decision in the intermediate level of that case before it settled, where it was decided that Trump and the Trump organization were liable for Trump University's misdeeds. So he doesn't always swim off. It's just that no one's really come at him this hard that often. And as for Cohen being the only one to turn, well, he's the only one or one of the only ones who's actually been indicted in Trump's inner circle. When things are actually hitting you and you're actually really seeing the prospect of being convicted of a crime, people's tune can change. So I think we're way too early to say that he's going to turn or not turn. I think once he's indicted, we could see a very different situation arise.
If he's indicted, although the Times says...
If he's indicted.
Weisselberg, right, although the Times says that...
If he's indicted. If Weisselberg's indicted, we could see a very different story. Yeah. Well, I'm going to let Michael respond to you because the orator that he is, I'm sure he has a rebuttal cooking. But I'll give you one more question before we bring him in, which is Weisselberg is someone that you dealt with in this manner. I'm reading here from Washington Post reporting. He oversaw the spending decisions at Trump U, the online program which drew those 3 lawsuits. The deposition in the case speaks to that. And so, you know, there are experts here who say Money Man only scratches the surface. He was, at times, basically the acting CEO. What, if anything, can you tell us about that based on your knowledge? And is that good or bad for him as he faces this heat? Well, first off, you can find out a lot about an organization, about a company, about a target without actually having them cooperate with you. So we were able to get a lot of information on how the Trump organization worked and Weisselberg's role in it, despite the fact that we did not have Weisselberg's cooperation. We never even felt like we needed to bring him in as a witness because we had already had enough knowledge of everything that we didn't really need Weisselberg, but we were still able to find the Trump organization liable. And a lot of why the judge in the Trump University case decided that Trump organization was liable was because of Weisselberg's very heavy-handed day-to-day control of the organization. Very much he was the acting CEO. I would also say that he was basically the COO, the chief operating officer of the Trump organization, a role which has never really been filled, at least not that I know of in the past 20 years. So the CFO, you know, they're the ones actually like keeping the books and tracking the P&Ls and seeing exactly what money's coming in and what money's going out and making some high-level decisions based on that. But Weisselberg was doing more than that. He would actually decide which businesses would live and which businesses would die. At one point, the Trump University was not making very much money at first, and it was Weisselberg who actually had the Trump University people come in and say, hey, this business better start making more money or I'm shutting it down. He gave them an ultimatum. That came from Weisselberg, not from Trump. We think of Trump being the guy who runs around telling people you're fired. In real life, a lot of times it was Weisselberg who was the enforcer. He was not just the bean counter. He had a lot of power within the organization to determine what businesses were going to do what, which ones would actually go forward, and which ones would be shut down.
Michael?
First off, I'm not going to clap back on the Assistant Attorney General. That's number one. So the brother, he's got the cred. I'm going to rely on that street cred on the point. But two, he actually just made the point I was probably not that well articulating, and that is, at the end of the day, Trump is in the game, but he's removed from the game. In other words, he's in the process, but he's removed from it. He creates that distance that when stuff goes south, he can go, well, that wasn't my decision. Weisselberg made that decision. Why? You know, he was running these operations. He was the one who made the financial determination to do X, Y, Z, to open something up or shut it down. It is that part of this process that to the first point where the Weisselberg goes, yeah, but we know how the communication goes in Trump world, right? So I act understanding what it is you want done. And if he comes forward and says, well, time out, let me just clarify how this communication process worked. Yeah, I made the decision, but here are the series of conversations I had with Trump in which it was either relayed to me indirectly or directly what strategy I should take. So if he does that, then all hell breaks loose. It opens up the game. But if he keeps it tight, that's where I'm like, I don't know how much they're going to be able to land on Trump. They'll get Weisselberg, but I don't know how much they'll be able to land on Trump. But, you know, I'm not in the case, so I rely on the attorney general who did prosecute the university case. So
let's go, Tristan, and then Professor.
I know. I agree with that. I think the kicker is that is Trump's defense is basically, I had nothing to do with that. It was Allen's problem, or it was the finance department's problem. I think the danger for Weisselberg there, as a number of other observers have pointed out, is that Trump could just throw Weisselberg under the bus here. So Weisselberg, if he wants to actually come out of this okay, if he thinks showing up to work every day is going to somehow endear him to Trump and that Trump will take care of him, it doesn't matter. Trump ultimately doesn't have loyalty about any of the other people around him. We'll see about how loyal he is to his own children. But right now, he's never really shown much loyalty to anybody that works for him. So we'll see. He could just decide that he's going to use Weisselberg as the scapegoat. So I very much agree with that.
Professor?
I think this all goes to the question of what the prosecutors are going to be able to prove here. And as Michael Steele says, the fact that Trump has managed to keep himself somewhat removed from the operation of all of these businesses makes everything hinge on what Allen Weisselberg will provide by way of information and how much Allen Weisselberg is really willing to go to the mattresses to preserve his relationship with Donald Trump or to save his own skin. So again, it really depends on what the prosecutors know about Weisselberg, what Weisselberg is willing to turn over, and ultimately how that connects, if at all, to former President Trump.
Melissa Murray, Tristan Snell, and Michael Steele on all the angles. Thanks to each of you.